Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how I created this. It's gonna be a pretty long tutorial, so I guess get your snacks and let's get started. So the first thing that I always emphasize is reference. And as you can see here, my reference game is not that good, but I just collected everything that could influence my decisions in the end. Just stuff for scale reference, especially this one. This is the image that inspired like the mood. And just a lot of other stuff that just looks good to me, and just some ground and foliage reference. I didn't end up putting that many puddles and stuff, but yeah. Also, if you'd like to get access to any of the scene files that I've created for this video or any of my previous scenes, including all of the assets, I would recommend checking out my Patreon. I post exclusive assets, scene files, and also premium content that I'm planning to upload exclusively to my Patreon of like lengthier breakdowns of certain scenes. If you enjoy that sort of stuff and also would like to just support what I do, I would heavily recommend checking out my Patreon. So as usual, we jump into Blender. I delete the default cube and the default light, put down a plane. I want to use this plane as the foreground, so I'm just going to subdivide it a lot and bring in a displacement texture that I'm going to use to create the foreground. I created these in World Creator. It's pretty easy and pretty handy tool to create decent looking height textures that you can bring into Blender. So I did that. I brought in both of them, and now I'm just going to set up the camera to get a composition that I like. So I go into my camera view. I also change in the clip end to about 100,000 because the scene is going to be large. Large scale scenes tend to be like at least a few thousand meters generally. But I just go that high for just safety, I guess. It doesn't matter really. Then I duplicate the mesh and rotate it because this time you're showing the backside of it. So it's gonna look like a completely different new asset. It helps you save on memory costs as well, especially in large scale scenes where you need a lot of graphical power to pull them off. Then I'm just gonna use proportional editing to just make the silhouette look the way I want and change the way they intersect with each other as well, so it looks more seamless. And also just put in the last third piece in the back. That's just gonna be there to like act as like leading lines, but not really anything serious. Then I noticed that the foreground needs to be much more detailed than that because that's going to look very low poly. So what I do is I mix these two shaders with a completely white BSDF, and I use an image texture that I'm going to use to mask them both out. And I import a basic grass texture you can find a lot on Polyhaven, and just tile it quite a bit, like 30-40 times so that it looks decent. And change the normal to like 3 to 4 times. And then you can use the image mask, you can put them in and then use the image mask to mask out the area that you want to be in the foreground that looks more detailed, while the background can have that nice texture variation that we got from the World Creator color map. And there you go. You can just tweak the image mask the way you want so that it blends in seamlessly. And you notice that there's a difference in hue and saturation. So you just take the hue saturation node, change the saturation a little, change the hue a little, change the value a little, and boom, it blends in seamlessly. Then I move on to creating the main villa you saw at the end, and for that I put down a basic cube, then inset the top and scale it down and pull them up so that it gives you a silhouette that you can use to build the tiles off of later. And after that, it's just a whole long process of experimenting with different shapes because I kind of wanted to go for like a long villa that expands, and then behind it you could imagine there could be like a pool with some trees and bushes and a kind of a garden. I also use these human mannequins that are of human scale to use as a reference because you don't want to make your house or villa like too huge and just make it feel a little off in a large scale environment especially. Then I want to start creating the main roof tile. For that I bring in a basic cylinder and I'm going to cut that down in half. I'm going to do the same with the faces, and then I'm going to extrude out the edges at the end to give it a kind of a shape that roof tiles generally have on Italian homes. You can squeeze it in a little and lengthen it out so it looks more like an actual roof tile and give it a solidify modifier. And there you have it. Then I bring it on the roof and bring in a human scale model as well. Remember to do that, otherwise you might mistakenly end up making the tile a little too big and it'll look off. Remember to also stay in local mode. It allows you to rotate and scale the tile much easier After that, I just kind of align it along the roof and use the array modifier, and it makes it pretty easy. And you can just stack an array modifier on top of the other one, and you can just put as many count of them as you want, and there you go. And you can just play around with the value of the z-axis on the array modifier. I also just duplicate it 90 degrees and kind of align it with the other edge. Now, how do you give the tiles the actual shape of the roof? Basically, put a boolean modifier, set it to intersect, use the object as the main villa, and put it to fast, and it'll already cut it down to the exact shape of the roof. Just make sure you only put the tiles inside of the roof a little bit, not too much, otherwise it'll mess up the scale of them. But yeah, just apply it to both of them, and there you go. And then after you apply it, you can just pull them back up and they have the exact shape. Now to give them some randomization, go into edit mode, press P, select by loose parse, and it'll separate all of them into their own thing. Then set origin to geometry, and while selecting all of them, press F3 and select randomize transform. It'll give you the ability to basically randomize all of them in their own unique way. Now you can just play around with the values here like I did. You can do it again, you can stack them on top of each other. Now you can't edit them after you make the changes, but you can play around, you can just keep doing it over and over and over. So I just repeat the same process with all of them and then place them all on each side of the roof. And that's the final result. Now I kept one roof tile separate, which I'm going to use to put on the edges where both of them intersect. As on Italian homes, they have this like line of one tile on top of another going to the top on the edges, and I'm just gonna put an array modifier and do the same. I'm just gonna align it in the rough direction and put the array modifier and then fine tune it so that it kind of just roughly goes on top of the edge where both of the sides intersect, and it's looking all right. So I just do the same randomize transform thing on that and then just duplicate it on all sides, and I'm pretty happy with the result. So now it's just a long ass process of doing the exact same thing on all of the roofs. So I start putting down tiles on each roof and then using the array and randomize transform on every single one. It's a kind of a painstakingly long process, but it's just something you have to go through as a 3D artist. Like there's just no way around certain things. Like maybe some genius could create a geometry nodes modifier for me, but like, yeah, I'm not that skilled at it, so I just have to do it manually. Sometimes, usually manual stuff gives a pretty good result, even though if it's not the fastest or the smartest way to do it. After I'm done with that, I am gonna duplicate one of the rooms, because there's no need to create a completely new one if it's gonna be the exact same shape. But I'm gonna keep the scale a little lower and just gonna rotate it by 90 degrees as well, so it doesn't look the exact same, it has some difference. And then I'm going to create a cube. I want this to be like a storeroom on the side. Repeat the same process with the tiles with it. Just use some randomized transform. Then put this in the back. I want it to look like there's like some actual stuff in the back that leads through that, I guess like the hallway, the archway that we created. And that's how it looks. Now we are going to move on to the lighting. Now I first of all bring in an HDRI, because that's just very important for getting the mood set, like because I want the mood to be kind of bluish in the shadows, and HDRIs are just a very good and easy way to get that set on. So I just changed the HDRI's saturation and value a little bit because I don't want it to be too bright or too saturated. I want the mood to be a little dim. Then I bring in a sunlight, change the strength to 10, have the angle to like 9 degrees. That just means that the shadows it casts are going to be pretty soft. Then I put a plane on the top, which creates those dramatic shadows that you saw. That's basically a light blocker. And I'm just going to put in a noise texture into the alpha with a color ramp and just play around with the values. And you can see already that it's casting shadows. Now, after this, it's all about just your sense of art direction. Like just, play with it. Set the values to maybe too high, too low, and then adjust from there to see and get a look that you're happy with. There's no right way to do it here, just your own intuition. Then I create more planes because obviously one light blocker is not gonna do it. So I create this other plane and set its alpha to 0.6 because I don't want it to be, again, completely black. I put up the scale of the big light blocker as well to 28. Then I again do the same noise texture thing with the smaller light blockers as well, so there's some diversity of shadows in them as well, but it's not going to be as dark or stark of a contrast as the bigger one. Then I put in a basic cube for the volume. This volume is not going to be anything complex at all. It's just going to be just a very simple shader, just volume scatter into the volume with 0.0005 or something like that, with like a little bit of anisotropy. And there you go. You already have those cool God rays that come down. It's not that hard to create God rays in Blender if you just do this basic process. And now you have to just adjust to what you exactly want from this scene. Like if you want a very dim, gloomy scene, you can go for that. I want the contrast to be a little higher and the light rays to come down a little bit more. So I'm gonna do that. Then for getting the viewer's attention to the front, I use an area light and put it on top of the villa because I want the viewer's attention to be there, and it also scatters the light on the top a little bit, which also creates a nicer look in my opinion. Then I just put more light blockers in the back because I don't want the mountains to take up too much attention, and just, you know, just changing up a little bit of the like meshes intersection that happens in the back. Just use proportional editing to do that. Change their scale a little bit. I'm not that happy with them. I want them to look even bigger and like more majestic. So just playing around with the scale and positioning a little bit more, and that looks much better. And I also have to come clean a little bit. I have been cheating on you guys a little, that I created a prototype house before I made this actual one. I know, I'm sorry, but what this ended up allowing me to do is use this as a background villa. Like, I want the world to actually feel like there's other things happening, like maybe another rich guy who wants to buy a property here in the medieval times and set up a home and start a farm or something. So that can act as that and just bring in more diversity to the scene. So I just place it there, just mess around with the rooms a little, and just create a decent looking background villa. Then I move on to texturing the tiles. For that, I just bring in a basic texture from Polyhaven and then use this amazing node by Blenderesse. It's completely free. I'll link it in the description, but it's called the Untilify node, and it just untilifies your textures. If you hate tiling, just use it. It works. It's simple. You just plug it in. It does its job. It's amazing. Then I just plug in a hue saturation node to get those nice orange reddish tones that you get in Italian homes on the rooftops. I really love that. Since this is not cutting it for me, I use a mix color node, and in the B I just go with a nice orange hue and then adjust further with the hue saturation, and now it looks much better. Then I apply the same texture to everything else on the roof, and obviously have to unwrap it. Just use cube projection, it works, it's pretty simple and it's pretty fast. Then to get even more diversity in the hues, I use a basic RGB node with a more reddish tint and mix it with a noise texture. This basically just gives you more diversity in the noise texture, and after playing around with the values for a little bit, I get a result that I'm pretty happy with. And now I can move on to the booleans and just like giving a better shape to the actual main villa. I basically select everything, give it a bevel, not a big bevel, a smaller one, then create a cube. This is going to be the main front entrance. I want it to be larger than basically every other entrance into the home. Then I give the home a solidify modifier, because for booleans, if you don't have that, they are weird, they don't work properly, they don't actually make a hole. So just apply a solidify modifier before doing a boolean. It'll just do its job, just trust me. Then I give it a bit more thickness actually, because I realize the thickness isn't enough. After doing that, I just bevel the top edges and you get a nice rounded entrance to the villa. It looks fine. Then I, while staying in edit mode, just duplicate it, bring it to the top, just modify the scale and use that as the top window. And then I place another cube. Then I want like a ledge that separates the top floor from the bottom ones. And for that, I bring in a basic cube. Then I go into edit mode and Control T to put edge loops inside. I count them exactly 8. Then while selecting them, press Control B and use basically 0 inside loops and then extrude them downwards. Then I to inset and then extrude them downwards again. And it just gives a nice silhouette and just a bit more of interesting look to them. And I do the same on the sides, just 8 edge loops, count them out, do the bevel, E to extrude, I to insert, then extrude again, and it looks good. Then I copy the booleans and just put a bunch more, just kind of doing it where it makes sense, where it doesn't look too off and too weird. Also giving the ledge that I put a bevel so that it looks better. Then I put in these edge loops at the bottom. I want them to extrude a little, otherwise it might look a little weird for it to be completely flat. I'm not sure exactly the reasoning behind it, it just looks nicer, and also I've seen homes do it, so I'm just doing it here. Then I just put in bevels basically everywhere that it makes sense, where there's supposed to be a window, or like back in the day there were no like electricity, right? So yeah, there were no like artificial light sources except I guess fire, so people used to have a bunch of windows, and after I put in all those windows, that's how it looks. I'm pretty happy with it. I also decided to put in a basic plaster texture that I get from Polyhaven on all of these meshes because they were just looking too wide and out of place, like they're creating weird bloom and just stuff like that. So I just decided to put in a basic plaster texture, just unwrap them all and apply it to them one by one. Just mess around with the normal strength and also just the hue a little bit, get them a bit of a yellowish hue. Then for this extra side room, I also decided to give it some doors and windows because it was just looking too boring, and now it looks much better. After I get done with that, I also decided to give it a deeper yellow hue because it just, I like that. There's not really a particular reason why, it just looks better to me. Then I start placing a bunch of human-sized mannequins everywhere. Why? Because that's where I want to build a path, and it's kind of necessary to just plan it out before you actually start building it, and also helping human-sized mannequins exactly along that path where you want to do it helps to keep you grounded. Sometimes you get lost when you're working on a huge scale scene, that you kind of zoom out a little too much and then you sculpt the path, and now the path is too huge for the background or even the foreground. Like for example here you can see, like, you know, it's easy to mess it up. So I zoom in a little, turn the radius down quite a bit, and then with dynamic topology on, I start sculpting. And I start sculpting along the human mannequins. Just try to make sure you don't go too deep because yeah, it's a path, so it's going to be a little deeper than the standard terrain because people walk on it. I don't know, horses or carriages walk on it, but don't go like too deep into it, otherwise it might look too weird. And then for the foreground, also making sure to sculpt it out a bit more, and I'm pretty happy with the result. Then about texturing it, because the path needs to be the color of the path, not of the grass. So for that, take out a BSDF, bring in a basic path texture, the same mix node image texture that you're going to use, plug it into it, and then just start using the image texture and paint everything by hand. It might be painstakingly long, but you know, it's just something you gotta do. You gotta do what you gotta do. And increase the scale of the texture quite a bit, and there you have it. Then to blend it in better, as you saw, the texture that I had was a little sharper, plug in a color ramp onto the image texture. Also have a mix color node and use the roughness of one of the materials, turn the mix color node into color burn, and just use that. It just gives it a much more sharper look and doesn't look like too smudgy or low poly, because the texture's resolution is ultimately very limiting. So using this gives you a better result. I ended up going with subtract here for now. I might end up changing it later. Then I go to Polyhaven, bring in some rocks, and use the hue saturation node again. I love this node, I just constantly use it. I just change up the value a little, make them a little brighter, desaturate them because I want them to be kind of white, and then use the geoscatter plugin, go to the distribution, and then the method I'm going to choose manual instead of the standard one. It allows you to go into manual mode and then hand place every single asset by hand. Now, this might not be the most fast or optimal way to do it, but it's probably the most realistic way to do it, in my opinion. You can use F to, like, right now you're seeing I'm getting clumps. You can use F to increase the radius so they don't self-collide, I guess. I go with this splatter node and then I just start placing them. There you go. Like, it's that easy. I'm using the F node and then just, you know, reducing the radius using that and just splattering them down. It looks much better. I heavily recommend the geoscatter add-on. If it's too expensive, you should try the Grasswald add-on, if I'm correct. It's free. Geoscatter is not, so that's the benefit of using it. It might not give you as good results as geoscatter does because it's just so well crafted and thought out for artists in mind. I'm not paid by them in any way. I just love it, and I would heavily recommend you try it out. Then I just hand place every single rock and it looks pretty good. From there, I decide to change the plaster texture on the villa. I use these two nodes again from Blenderesse. It's free. They just are procedural nodes that use ambient occlusion and bevel to give your villa a better grungy look. They just take procedural things into account and it's just magic, honestly. Like, I mean, you can just go into the node and check what they do if you want to learn exactly how to do it. I just use them in a lot of things I do to just add quick grunge and detail without actually spending hours, and it looked good enough. Then I'm just going to create a basic wooden frame around one of the windows, since the windows currently look pretty black and hollow, and that does not look good. That's not a good look. So I'm gonna make this one by hand, but for the rest I'm going to go to Sketchfab and get this window frame and this nice looking door I found for free. It's CC0, you can download it for free as well. Sketchfab still works partially, like if you want to buy something you have to go to Fab, but if you want these free assets you can still just get them from Sketchfab. So I just bring it in as a USD and I'm gonna place them all around. You don't need a unique door for every single place, just use the same one. That's how it kind of used to be as well. And then for the camera motions, just put down a basic end and start for keyframe and then change them to linear because you don't want a weird Bezier curve where it slows and fastens up in the middle of it. And then do a basic rotation keyframe at the start and the end where you want it to pan from like looking at the ground and then showcasing grand scale at the end. And then get the Shakify add-on, which is also free by Ian Hubert. It's amazing. And I just put a basic, very small camera shake into it. It just looks good enough. Then for the second scene, I do the exact same thing. I put in the start and the end keyframes right after the first shot ends. So the first shot ends at 130, the other starts at 131. It's pretty smooth and simple, just 2 keyframes. After that, I bring in the 2 trees, 3 trees actually, that I created in SpeedTree. I use the basic preset that it comes with. I just modified them a little, and then I just go into the exact same mode I showed you guys just before in Geoscatter, and then use that to scatter all of these everywhere. I kind of want these trees to just go as like boundaries for like farms, like generally older European and even current farms. There's like these boundaries that are created using trees, and that's the kind of look I want. Like I want there to be like a bunch of them, exactly like kind of this, and they just stretch far across back up till the hills. Do the exact same for all of the hills, but obviously in the hills they're not going to do farming. So I kind of make it come across as, yeah, like most of them are just kind of wild trees that just grow, but they kind of started cutting into it a little bit where the land is still flat enough so that they could farm, that kind of vibe. And I'm pretty happy with the results so far. I also go on Polyhaven real quick to get more bushes. Basically everything in Polyhaven is free, so I would heavily recommend you use their site if you don't want to spend money on a lot of assets. They have pretty good photo scan stuff, textures, HDRIs, a lot of stuff. So I just use the exact same tool from Geoscatter to plant everything. Just make sure to not overdo it. Only put it at places which can act as like, obviously like you should place them where they look natural, but also can kind of act as leading lines towards the main scene. They don't block the main focal point of your scene, but kind of block the side areas and just kind of funnel the viewer's eye into the center. Then I also forgot to place the windows, so I decided to do that. I just go through every single window, place it. Also, again, go to Polyhaven to get some grass. This grass is pretty light, honestly. Like they even give you some LODs that you can use, basically lower level of detail in the grass, which means they're much faster to render. And for larger scale scenes where the grass is kind of distant, you need that. It will destroy your PC, trust me, if you use higher quality grass. I've tried. Also, while I was trying to place the grass, I decided to give the front house a little pond as well. So I just use proportional editing after subdividing the plane, put a basic cube to use as the main pond texture. I bring in the old pond texture that I created in my previous video. I recommend you go watch that if you want to just get how I made it. It's pretty simple. I just tweak around the texture a little bit. Also, I go in the ground texture and mask that area out. I use the same path texture that I used because it's kind of sandy and it gives a good enough look. I just mess around with the strength of the mask so that it's kind of soft and it's not too like jagged and super harsh on the edges. I also noticed that it was too harsh on the edges on the main road as well, so I just kind of lightened that up a little. And then after I'm done with that, I duplicate the ledge that I created that separated the floors to the bottom floor as well, because it just makes it kind of look better to me. Then I do the same with these rose bushes. I'm not sure if they're rose bushes, they're violet colored bushes if I'm correct. Just scatter them around everywhere in the main home. I don't want them to be almost anywhere else except the front home. I've noticed that Italian homes kind of have these kind of bushes generally. I think on the more on the southern regions if I'm correct, or maybe the central, I'm not sure, but they just look great, so I do that. I also realized that just one grass layer was not going to cut it because it did the job in the background. Due to the parallax, it looked dense enough, but in the foreground it was looking pretty damn empty. You could see the grass surface below pretty easily. So I basically duplicate that grass texture, increase the density by a lot, and use an image mask and mask out only the front areas that are going to be like really close to the camera, so it's not apparent that the density of the grass is that low, because that's going to break the illusion. So I just increase the density, and using that mask, it looks much fuller. It looks like there's actually a decent ecosystem going on in the ground. Like, it doesn't even have to be that complex. It's the same exact grass mesh, but since it's got like bunch of different scale, rotation values, then I'm using the grow mask that you can use in Geoscatter to grow certain areas using a noise map, that kind of stuff, and that allows it to be much more realistic. After I'm done with that, just, play around with the scale. Again, just messing around with the density and all of that to make it look better. Afterwards, I decide to tweak other things like the rock placements, just removing it from certain places, putting it back down in certain places. It's all just about changing up the textures, because now at this endpoint, you're probably going to spend like a lot of hours just fine-tuning and tweaking a lot of your stuff. Just do a test render of how it's coming along. It looks okay, but I decided to tweak a little bit of the distribution of the grass on the far back. The mask of the grass was a bit off, so I tweaked that much more. I also realized that this area where I'm painting right now was a little, I guess, shallow, like there was not enough grass density there. So again, I paint the mask there as well that I'm using for the foreground, and now it's looking much more dense. After that, again, just going back into the trees, I think they're too uniform. They're way too shallow as well. Like, there's not enough depth there. There's not enough variation there. They look the exact same. It puts me off a little. So just tweaking their position, rotation, just putting a bunch more down gives me a better result. I also start putting down some trees on the foreground now, because it looks a little off if there's only trees in the background and absolutely not a single one in the foreground. So you just gotta do that a bit more. I bring in a massive tree that just changes the whole vibe, I think, of the villa. It also like gives you kind of just a like, there's something going on in the back, there's a big tree, what's up there? Just like makes you think what might be behind. It just like adds more, even if there's nothing. Using these kind of small things, you can just add a little bit more to the imagination of the viewer, like how paintings are, kind of like where you have to fill in the gaps, that kind of thing. Then I have to obviously do some more texture work on the main plaster because it looks just too plain, and I decide to bring in bricks, and right now I'm just unwrapping them because I realized the rotation was off of some of the buildings. So just going into the UV maps and rotating them by 90 degrees so that the bricks look like bricks, and just remapping every single thing. It's some things you just gotta do by hand. I wish there was a better way to do UVs, but I haven't found one. You just gotta tweak things by hand like this. It's kind of annoying, but you just get through it. Then how do you actually mix them? Again, the standard procedure of mixing them using a mix shader and an image texture, going into the factor, just creating a new one, give it like a 2K size, just multiply those values by 2, and you have 2048. That's good enough for me. Then you can already start painting by hand, but obviously you're gonna quickly see that it looks kind of bad. So to fix that, we're gonna take a color ramp and take the displacement texture. That's the wrong one. Take the displacement texture, plug it in the color ramp, mix them together, set the mode to color burn, increase the contrast between the bricks so that the whites are going to be bricks and the black is going to be the plaster. and after mixing it using color burn, you can even change the mix factor. I keep it at 1, it looks good for me. Doing that and just then hand painting every single texture exactly where you want it to peek through, keeping the strength to like 0.6, because if you keep it at 1 it looks a little too off, and just tweaking those, it looks good enough. I go back to Sketchfab and I find this cross, because generally I've seen Italian homes also have this kind of cross going on, just like religious stuff in general going on, especially older ones. So I go to this museum site apparently that is on Sketchfab. They have a ton of these kind of older stuff, just photo scan and just put on CC0 for free. So I just bring it in. I put a basic, just like this thing that is supposed to kind of like hold it on top and give it the same tile texture, and it looks good. So I just basically duplicate it and place it on every single, I guess, like peak of the home where like all the tiles meet. And on this one, I kind of want a chimney going on. I just give it the same plaster texture and it looks good. Then I go back, I realize that there's not enough variation, I guess, among the plants that there are available in the scene. So I go back to Polyhaven and get this, I don't even know what to call it, just like flowers? Yeah, flowers. And they just add a lot of vibrance to the scene and just some diversity. I also go back and get this rock. I really like this rock. I can use it to, like, it's a bigger rock, so I can use it to kind of just frame the shot much better, because it's like a long, big, chunky rock piece. I like that. Then I bring in some VDBs. If you've seen my last video again, I showed you guys the texture of them. It's just like a custom VDB that I have that I just use in a bunch of scenes. Then just making some final tweaks to the main path. I realized that it was a little too high. Go back to Polyhaven, bring in some twigs, some leaves, just start scattering them back again. I really just want to add as much diversity and just variation in things as much as I can. After that, when I did a final render, I realized that in the back the texture was way too uniform. So I just take an image texture, mix the same grass texture but with a very low scale with it, and that already gives a lot more variation in the back. As you can see, there's a much like different hue stuff going on, and also since the normals are stronger, that gives a lot more variation again. You can even mix the same image texture with itself with a noise factor going into it, and you can change the hue and saturation of one of them, make it much darker or lighter, whatever you want. Change the hue, change the saturation to give even more texture variation, because this kind of stuff is the stuff that just you don't notice when you're doing it, but when you view it at the end, you kind of realize, maybe I could have done better here. So just keep rendering, keep noticing these kind of things, and keep making these slight changes that make your renders pop just that little bit more. After that, I decided to do a final pass with the trees. This kind of stuff you can just not do enough, I guess. Like, you can just keep spending hours into it. Then I decided to just remove one of the light blockers that I have, because I just thought that some more light rays peeking through would just look better, add a bit more life to the scene. Going back into Sketchfab to get a bird model, I realized that there's not enough stuff to emphasize just how vast the scale of this scene is. So adding these kind of tiny birds just fluttering around adds much more to that. Just grandiosity of the scene. Just duplicate them, put like 5-6 of them around, just parent them to an empty and just animate that empty from one location to the other. Then just before I do the final render, I always like to do a small compositing pass right in Blender. I just use the glare node, use the threshold and the mix values a little to just tweak it a little bit, just to give the foreground a little bit of a pop. Then use lens distortion. This allows me to emphasize the scale of the scene even more. If you just set the distortion to like 0.03, it just gives it that little bit more of a pop. And after I do that, I take it into DaVinci. In DaVinci, I don't do like too much. I just add like some film grain, some bloom, some halation. Halation adds just like some glow to the edges that are like the brightest in the scene. Stuff like that. Add a vignette, not too strong, just light enough. And just change like the contrast curve, just desaturate it a little, honestly, because I felt like the saturation was too much. Contrast, stuff like that. And after doing all of that, here we have the final result.